College with Chris Graham.
Welcome to the podcast. Chris Graham. I'm joined by Jerry Carter today on a Friday. We'll get you ready for an ACC football weekend. Tonight, Virginia Tech and Duke. Tomorrow, UVA-Notre Dame. We got a lot to get into and other games as well. And Jerry, I hope things are going well for you on the West Coast.
The countdown clock has started, Chris. I'm really excited. It's 4 o'clock for us when they kick the ball off in Blacksburg. It's going to be a fun weekend. And I have to say, I think we both have a great opportunity this weekend to lay some cement on the path, if you will. I'm just not sure. Listening to your podcast yesterday about with the breakdown of the game, Chris, let's talk about UVA first in the fact that the level of accomplishment they will achieve. And I'm not going to say if. I'll go with you. I'll say when they beat Notre Dame tomorrow and go to 5-0 with that level of a win, being 2-0 in the conference. Let's open up by talking about how unprecedented this will be.
Well, a Virginia win, and I think Virginia's in the top 10. This time of year, voters, from a voting standpoint, whatever that means, and it means something, but voters are more apt to reward teams who go out and get big wins, and especially, a Virginia win at Notre Dame means a road win over a number 10 team that just last week played number 3 to the last drive in number 3's home stadium. So, it would get the attention of the football world, college football world, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I was trying to think back to the last time a game of this significance was played by a UVA football team. I was in the stadium in 1990 when Virginia beat Clemson for the first time ever in school history, 29-game losing streak. That year, the Hoos rose all the way to number 1 for 3 weeks, and I was in the stadium when that number 1 ranking went away on a last-second field goal by Georgia Tech. Scott Sisson will always be an enemy to UVA Nation. Hopefully, I'm sure he's a nice guy, but we will never forget his last-second field goal to beat us in that game. There have been some other big games since. I talked about the '95 team that went 9-4 and lost 3 games. Michigan, Texas, and Virginia Tech on the last play, and could have easily been a top 10 team that year. 2004, Virginia was a top 10 team in November, playing a top 10 Miami team in Scott Stadium. I was in the stadium for that, and lost that game. So at least since 2004, but I would go all the way back to 1990 because this is a Virginia team at 4-0, number 18 in the country, playing number 10 tomorrow. And you win that game, and you are definitely in the playoff conversation. So it's been almost 30 years, 29 years since the last time we played a game of this significance.
So, for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to listen to yesterday's podcast that Chris did, he did a really nice job of breaking down the matchups and the X's and O's of the game. So you have that to either reflect on or to look forward to listening to. Chris, let's talk about, just for a second, and I'm going to fall back on my experience of making the trip to South Bend the first time when Duke played up there a few years ago. For me, and I'm not sure how this fits into the mindset of the player, but obviously a lot will be made of the size of the crowd and the possible noise of the crowd. None of that was really a factor for me. In other words, I came there trying to absorb the day, see and feel the experience. Yes, the place was packed. Yes, it was packed full of Notre Dame fans, but it wasn't an intimidating atmosphere as much as I felt the surroundings were. I felt the history of the place. Touchdown Jesus, the Golden Dome. Hearing and seeing all of this was a bigger factor than the noise that the crowd could make that given day. You talked about the fact that the UVA players have not played in this atmosphere. They have not played in a game of this relevance. How do you think Bronco will deal with the potential overwhelming experience of the game taking place in South Bend.
Well, and I'd say one thing. You've talked about that Duke Notre Dame game. That was a Notre Dame team that eventually finished 4-8. Not to say that fans aren't going to still be loud for their team, but tomorrow Notre Dame's back's against the wall. I've talked about that the last few days. They're a 2-1 team, and yes, they played Georgia great, but one more loss, and Notre Dame is not in the playoff picture anymore. A 2-2 team, even if they win out, they go 10-2. They're not going to play their way back in. They'd have 2 losses to a Georgia team, Virginia team. I'm remembering, I didn't go to this game myself, but my buddy Jay, best man in my wedding, lifelong best friend, he went to the Michigan game that Virginia played in 1995. I talked about the 95 team that, boy, they had Tiki and Rondé Barber. They had James Ferrier, 3 guys who were nominated 2 weeks ago for inclusion in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. They were on that Virginia team. Good Virginia team. And they played in the Big House to open that season, 1995. And Jay went to the game, and Jay said he spent the first quarter and a half of that game looking around and saying, my God, this place is big. And couldn't help but think that the Virginia players were probably a bit overwhelmed, but just by the fact there were 110,000 people at that game. Now, there will be 80,000 people at the game tomorrow. But this Virginia team has not played in front of a crowd of bigger than 57,000 people. Nobody on the field for UVA has played in front of a bigger crowd than that. The most intimidating crowd they've played in front of was probably the Blacksburg game last Black Friday, and that wasn't even a full house. There were 10,000 empty seats in Lane Stadium on that Friday afternoon / Friday evening. And so, what you do if you're Bronco, he talked about at his press conference this week, they were going to work some crowd noise into their game preparation, in their indoor practice facility, trying to, simulate some crowd noise because you have to work on some things. Virginia often snaps out of the shotgun. I'd say 90-95% offensive snaps out of the shotgun. Maybe it's a higher percentage than that. I think there are a couple of plays they run with Bryce Perkins under center, but everything's out of the shotgun. So you got to do things differently. When you're in Scott Stadium, where Virginia's played 3 of their first 4 games, the crowd's going to be quiet largely during offensive drives for Virginia, so you can actually call out signals. But with 80,000 people, hostile environment, you've got to probably do some sort of a hand system, a foot system. I mean, where the center's looking for that, some kind of timing system of some sort to get that snap off and have everybody go off at the same time. So there's changes there, both for the center and quarterback, but also for all the linemen, for the receivers on both ends. I mean, you've got it's different. It is different. Defensively, it may be a little different in the sense that it will probably be quieter when you're out there, so you can make your defensive signals. But it's going to be a different pressure. And plus, Virginia's played on national TV, if you want to call ESPN on a Saturday night national TV, but I think there's something different about these NBC games. I really do. It just feels different. It feels different playing in Notre Dame Stadium. And going into this game that there's something to play for that you've never had a chance to play for. All these kids came to Virginia recruited by coaching staffs. Some of there's still a few London holdovers. All the Bronco guys who've come in, they weren't necessarily recruited being promised to compete for a potential playoff bid, and now they're playing for that. I mean, we might be the only people talking about that, but you are playing for. You win this game, you're in the playoff race. And so I kind of think back to the 2013-2014 UVA basketball team. A bunch of guys, Joe Harris, Malcolm Brogdon, London Parentes, guys who were not necessarily thought of when they were being recruited as guys who were going to be centerpieces of a Sweet 16 team, a number 1 seed NCAA tournament team, but they played themselves into that position. These guys tomorrow have a chance to play themselves in that position that Virginia basketball team did a few years ago, to be the foundation piece of something even bigger as seasons go on. But they got to go out there and play tomorrow. And I don't know that when you're actually out there on the field that you're thinking that. When you're on the field, you're thinking play call, got to execute, got to go tackle somebody or block somebody or catch a ball or whatever you got to do, and then you get up and you do it again. But tomorrow when they wake up, when they eat breakfast, when they eat lunch, those butterflies will be there. And they've played themselves into earning the opportunity to have butterflies, which is awesome. But then they got to go play a game afterwards, and we'll see how they react.
Well, it was kind of neat. You were talking about the pumped-in noise, and one of the stories out here said that the noise that he was pumping in was actually the Notre Dame fight song, so that kids will have gotten used to listening to that. And it's a unique situation. Like I said, I have been fortunate enough to have seen sporting events in a lot of places in my day. And Notre Dame last week, Georgia, obviously people know about the SEC and the fan base. The stadium, Chris, in Georgia is actually the 9th largest stadium in the world. Not in college football, but in the world. And it's a situation to where there's some soccer stadiums here and there built. But so for Notre Dame, I'm not sure how often they go on the road and play in front of a fan base that does affect the game. I've been fortunate enough to sit in between the hedges and watch them play. So Notre Dame is actually coming off of a game where they had limited fans in attendance. They were dealing with noise, and were actually dealing with a stage that I don't want to say is bigger than theirs, but it was a different feel for them. In South Bend, the mystique that South Bend had at one point, the stadium is still there, but I don't think that the level of mystique is quite the same. And I love the fact that Brian Kelly has worked as hard as he has to make them relevant. But you're correct. If Notre Dame loses this game tomorrow, their season for everything that they're playing for is done. Yeah. And that they have to know that. They have to be aware of that. We're not talking about something that Brian Kelly's not talking about himself. So let's let you put on the coaching cap for a second. And Bronco calls up later today and says, Chris, come over here and talk to my kids for 10 minutes. Uh-huh. What would you tell them?
Well, I was thinking too, to the level that I can relate slightly in the sense that I've been a distance runner for the last several years, and I've run all kinds of races. I have run little 5 and 10Ks. I ran the Charlottesville Marathon with about 200 participants, and a marathon with 200 participants means you're running for long stretches by yourself. There's nobody out there cheering you on. You're not even running necessarily with anybody beside you. And then I ran my next marathon after the Charlottesville Marathon was the New York City Marathon, which is the exact opposite kind of experience. 50,000 racers. There were millions of people on the streets. Everywhere you went except for the bridges, there were people lining both sides of the street. It was loud. It was deafening. After the marathon was over, a bigger issue for me than being fatigued from running 26.2 miles was I had a splitting headache from all the noise. And I can tell you that on the bus ride over, because you had to ride the Staten Island Ferry, you had to ride a bus from the Staten Island Ferry to the starting line. I mean, there was all this going on, and before the other races, it was just get ready, go run, finish, etc. I was nervous, and I wasn't going to win the marathon to say the least, but just wanting to do well in front of all those people, not trip and fall. I mean, little things like that. I can identify to some degree. I mean, you play games like last year. Virginia played some home games in front of 30,000 people, and that was a good team, 8-5 team, won a bowl game, and still played in front of 30,000 people at home. Tomorrow, you're playing in front of it's going to be the biggest game they've ever played. But what I'd say is just like in my marathon experience, when I ran the Charlottesville Marathon with 200 people, when I ran the New York City Marathon with 50,000 people, you still just took one step at a time. And the football game tomorrow, once the all the pageantry is dealt with, the two teams run on the field, they carry their flags, they have the coin toss, everybody's jumping up and down for the opening kickoff. Once that opening kickoff goes off, it's a football game. Just like you played last week against ODU, just like you played on Friday nights in high school. You still have to go out there. You execute your assignments. You block. You tackle. You catch the ball, and you do the little things every play by play. And if you do the things you're supposed to do play by play, block out the crowd noise, block out everything else. and just go out there. And you can't win the game until you make every single play. There will be 150 to 160 plays in that game total between the two sides. Each team will have 75 to 80 snaps, roughly. Execute on all of those plays, and you will win the game. Because I think Virginia, I talked about this yesterday. I think schematically, I think Virginia with a 3-3-5 defense, I think they will slow Notre Dame down enough. And if I were Notre Dame, I'd be concerned about Bryce Perkins based on what they weren't able to do to stop Louisville in game one of this season. I think Virginia wins this game if they go out and execute. And so to the kids, every single play. Don't think about the stakes. Don't think about playoff. Don't think about the fact you're in Notre Dame Stadium playing in the Golden Dome, touchdown Jesus, all the rest of that. You can enjoy that after the game. Take some pictures on the field after the game, posing with the celebration of having beaten Notre Dame. But you got to do it play by play.
If you had taken a quick look at Notre Dame and their games up till this point, and the Louisville game, because that was Louisville's very first time ever on the field under a new coach. When they played New Mexico, not only was it, as we could say, they were playing New Mexico, but they were playing New Mexico without their head coach, right, who happens to be a former Notre Dame coach who wasn't healthy enough for the trip. And then they did what most teams do, and they kicked the mess out of the bye week. But it's looking at Notre Dame up till this point, Chris, I'm not sure that their best game hasn't been their loss. I went into, again, looking back at Georgia and Georgia's offense and being in a situation of playing that game at home, there was no doubt in my mind that Georgia was just going to run up and down the field on Notre Dame. And when Notre Dame actually played, their defense played at a level that kept that from happening. So which people are going to be watching the game? We're all going to be watching it in different manners. And you talked about you're going to be following the first, watching the second half. But which is your greater concern? Is it Virginia's ability to move the ball or Notre Dame having too much offense for the Virginia defense? Which side of the ball gives you the most level of concern?
I'll go into that this way. I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm concerned or not concerned about either side, but maybe I'll first talk about the Notre Dame offense. The Notre Dame offense, they don't run the ball well. At least they haven't through 3 games. They haven't run, and they don't seem committed to the run. And maybe that's the bigger thing. But they're not running for great numbers, and that's not good when you're getting ready to play a Virginia team that is great against the run. Virginia is giving up 75 yards per game, 2.2 yards per attempt. A lot of that is sack yardage because Virginia leads the nation in sacks, which is amazing. Last year, they've already got 20 sacks this year. They had 26 all of last year. They're now last year, this Virginia defense averaged 4.8 tackles for loss per game. They've doubled that, 9.8 tackles for loss per game for this Virginia defense. It's a Virginia defense in the mold that Bronco Mendenhall wants to play defense. He plays. It's technically a 3-4. 3 down linemen, 4 linebackers, and then 4 secondary members, 2 defensive backs and 2 safeties. But it's really what's called a 3-3-5, and it's a defense popular on the West Coast. It's really 3 down linemen, 3 linebackers, a hybrid linebacker safety, and then your 2 safeties, 2 cornerbacks. And the idea is speed. When you think about some successful college programs of the last, say, 30 years, think about Miami back in the 80s and 90s. They were a speed defense. The Florida State teams of the 90s and 2000s, they emphasized speed on defense. Not having a bunch of big front 7 guys. Your front 3, your 3 down linemen are supposed to basically eat up blocks. Your linebackers make tackles. You have that hybrid safety linebacker making tackles. You've got speed at cornerback and at safety. And so ideally, this defense for Virginia is a defense that, you don't have one guy making 15 tackles. Last week they did. Charles Snowden literally had 15 tackles. He's National Defensive Player of the Week. But normally, you'll see a bunch of guys with 7 or 8 tackles because they're swarming to the ball. If I would talk about the concern I've got on this Notre Dame team offensively, it would be that there's two really big targets for Ian Book. The run game is not a concern as far as my game analysis, but you do have Chase Claypool, a big 6'4", 229-pound wideout. I think when he goes to the next level, he probably puts 10 or 15 pounds on and becomes a tight end. He's a big guy, but he's a wideout. They line him up in a slot. They'll line him up at wide receiver, split out there. Bryce Hall is going to be tasked with taking him down one-on-one. And that's going to be – Bryce Hall is the best defensive player in the nation coming back from last year. He would have been a first-round pick last year if he'd have gone in the draft as a junior. And one advantage he's got, Claypool 6'4", 229 for the most part when he lines up against other defensive backs. Most defensive backs are 5'9", 5'10", between 170, 180, 185. Hall is 6'1", 200, and he doesn't sacrifice speed at that with his height and his weight, his heft. But if Hall can at least control Claypool one-on-one out there, normally teams, when Notre Dame plays teams, they have to bracket with Claypool. You've got to have the cornerback, but you've also got to have a safety in the vicinity to make sure that, basically not quite double coverage, but sometimes double coverage and at least having two guys' attention on there. And what that does is opens up the middle of the field for their other big weapon in the passing game, Cole Kmet, 6'5", 250, tight end. And he's a guy who missed the first two games, was back last week, had 9 catches, 108 yards. And so when you've got those two guys in your passing offense, you've got two big physical guys, one at wide out, one at tight end. And so now you've got to figure with Claypool, you've also – so if you've got to double up on Claypool, you've got to double up then on Kmet. That could open things up for your running game. But I think Virginia can with Hall can at least control Claypool. Then they can worry about Kmet in the middle, and then still control the run game. So I think as long as Hall has the game we expect out of Bryce Hall, I think Virginia can keep this Notre Dame offense in check. On the other side of the ball, Notre Dame's only got 4 sacks this year. Virginia, whatever issue they've had this year so far with a 4-0 record, has been the offensive line not playing consistently. This Notre Dame team does not get pressure on the quarterback. So if Virginia can take advantage of that, establish the run game early, and then get Notre Dame behind the chains defensively, and allow Bryce Perkins to have some short yardage situations, 2nd and 4s, 3rd and 1s, and you give then Notre Dame's got to gamble to try to stop the chains from moving. Bryce Perkins can really take advantage of that. Of course, Joe Reed got to have Joe Reed involved in this game to a much bigger level than he was last week against ODU. Just 4 catches against ODU last week. I'd love to see maybe 10, 12 targets to Joe Reed, maybe even a couple of runs, either reverses or just the little pop passes you see. But I'd love to see him have a chance for 10 to 12 touches this week. If you get Reed more touches, Perkins out on the perimeter a bit, I think the Virginia offense can move the ball pretty consistently.
Everything he just said there sounds very believable. It's funny from a standpoint, because as Brian Kelly has tried to put Notre Dame back on the quote unquote map of big time football, in my mind he's yet to land the 5-star quarterback. They've had some nice players through there, but they haven't had the quarterback that is coming in there and you're worried about, well, this guy's going to throw for 400 yards on us. And it's a situation to where the defense travels, and I'm really not I don't want to go as far as putting a number on the board, but I don't think that the Virginia defense is going to struggle all that mightily with the Notre Dame offense. My concern is a little bit on the other side of the ball is Perkins is as creative of a player as there is in college football if he's not having to run for his life. That's going to be the big question in my mind. And because I have to flash back to the original class of Saturday Night Live when they created the show, and they called the group the Not Ready for Primetime Players. And I'm sitting here looking at this game, and we talked on Monday, and we talked about the fact that there is no moral victory here. But if Virginia can go up here and win this game, I think it takes the program to an entirely different level. Is that an overstatement?
Oh no, it's not an overstatement at all. I'll go back to the 2013-2014 basketball team, which started 9-4, got blown out by Tennessee, then ran through the ACC, won the ACC tournament, lost to Michigan State in the Sweet 16. There were a lot of opportunities during that stretch, from the loss to Tennessee all the way through to the NCAA tournament, where people kept waiting for that Virginia team to fall on its face, and they didn't. And since then, that Virginia program has been one of the more dominant programs in college basketball. This is the first test for this Virginia football team. Last year was a nice year, 8-5. They played some games. They had Pitt in Scott Stadium in early November. Virginia, going into that game, was first place in the Coastal, ranked, lost the game. You had the 2 overtime losses to the Techs, Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech. Impressive performance against South Carolina, but the one signature game, they didn't complete the signature. They failed against Pitt. They win that game, and they might win the Coastal. Last year, they might have been a year ahead of schedule, and I think probably 2 years ahead of schedule. I didn't think they'd be where they are this year until maybe next year or the following year, because that's the extent of how deep the rebuild was for Bronco Mendenhall and his group. They've really, in year 4, they've got this program playing a playoff, perhaps meaningful game already. Just can't believe that they're doing that. But yes, we have to remember, this is the first game that this program has played of this nature. And I'll talk about 29 years ago, but what that means is literally none of the players were alive then. The coaches were in middle school or elementary school for the most part themselves. Bronco was still just a young assistant somewhere in 1990. So effectively, since Bronco came in, brought his assistant coaches with him, he's been building his program from scratch in 2016. This is the first test of this program at a huge level. This is the first really, really big game they've played. And so I think the only thing that could be a holdup, and I don't think that when I say this, I don't mean it like the players are worried about this, the coaches are thinking about this, but they don't have experience playing in these kind of games. The Notre Dame kids, they show up there, when they show up as freshmen there are 3 classes ahead of them who've already played. Every time Notre Dame plays a game, when they play New Mexico, they're still Notre Dame. They still have the target on their backs. Every time they walk on campus, when they're at home for holidays, they're Notre Dame football players. There's expectations that go with that. I read a nice article in The Athletic about the rise of Virginia football. It was published earlier this week, and some of the players talked about how in the 2016 season, guys who were on the team then and are still with the program now in 2019, that 2016 season, Virginia finished 2-10, got blown out by Richmond in their opener. Guys said that they didn't even, they wouldn't wear football gear around grounds. They would hope that people wouldn't recognize them as football players when they were in class. That's how bad things were 3 years ago. Now they're playing in a potential playoff game. So that's the only thing that would worry me, is just that, maybe they're not ready for the moment. We'll see. That's, and if they play this game tomorrow and avoid silly mistakes. Don't drop a punt. Don't hit a quarterback late or a player late on a 4th down play. We've seen that happen this year a couple times. But avoid the silly mistakes. From a pure X and O standpoint, I think Virginia's a better team. But they've got to go out and execute. And the Notre Dame kids do this all the time, and the Virginia kids, this is their first time doing this.
So before we switch off to the next topic, I want to give you one more chance. I like the little synopsis on the last podcast. Not only are you talking about Virginia winning this football game, but I also believe they can win this football game. Last thought on UVA-Notre Dame heading into tomorrow.
Last thought. Well, I will not get to watch any of the game for me. Now I'm going to just make this all about me. But I won't get to watch any, and I'll be looking at the score. I'll have a score up during the game when I'm broadcasting my VMI Wofford game. The UVA Notre Dame game will start at about 3:40 p.m. I'll probably be late third quarter when it starts. So During my commercial breaks, I'll have an eye on the UVA-Notre Dame game. I will be so jealous of everyone else out there who watches it from the first play. I will be just as nervous, if not more nervous, than all of you fans listening right now to me, because I don't get to see it until probably halftime. But I fully expect that when I do get to turn it on, that it's going to be a game, that Virginia will be in the game. Maybe the score will be around 14-10 Virginia at halftime. And Notre Dame will have a chance to lick its wounds a bit and kind of figure out what hit them. I will say that Brian Kelly had some nice comments in his Monday presser. Georgia also plays a 3-4 defense. He said Virginia's defense reminds him, from what he'd seen, reminds him of what Georgia does. Georgia's the number 3 team in the country. But yeah, I will. And then I've already worked this out. Wade Branner, voice of the Keydets. He's also the sports information director at VMI. I told Wade, I've got to hang out there afterwards. I can't get in the car and drive for an hour and miss even another hour of this game. Is there somewhere I can just sit in the press box, sit in a corner? You guys are all doing your work, your post-game wraps, everything else. Is there a place for me to sit and watch this game on my iPad so I don't have to miss anything? He said, sure. And I said, preferably a corner because, I'll probably be cursing a bit every time there's a bad play or a perceived bad call. He said, sure, just go sit in one of the coaches' boxes. They're yelling in there all the time. So I've got a coach's box reserved. I'm ready to watch some football, and I just wish the game was starting in like 5 minutes. That's how ready for this one I am.
Speaking of being ready for a game to start, we'll use that as the segue over. There's Virginia Tech Duke, ESPN national game tonight, 7 o'clock for you, 4 o'clock for me. I have this one earmarked as the biggest game on the schedule for Duke, and that I also believe it's one that's going to carry 2 or 3 victories with it. In my mind, if they go in to Blacksburg tonight and can win this game, you're in a situation to where I see them finishing 8-4. If they go up to Virginia Tech and can't win the game, I've got them finishing 6-6. I just feel like these guys are young, obviously, with the exception of Harris, who's actually already got his degree from Duke. He's working on his master's, but he's young as far as time on the field. The future for these guys was next year and the year after. But if they can win this game tonight, I think it really sets them up to have a successful season, maybe a year ahead of schedule. You've been following the same Virginia Tech team I'm following. They've had a week off. At this point in coaching, how many adjustments can you make? You watch the film of the Virginia Tech Furman game. How many adjustments can Virginia Tech make? Because they also understand the same way that Notre Dame understands if you lose this game, your aspirations are done. Virginia Tech is in a similar situation. They've already lost a conference game. If they lose this game, they have 2 losses, and their hopes of winning the Coastal, I think, would be a reach at that point. So tell me, if you're Virginia Tech, what are you going to try to do tonight to take care of business?
Boy, there's so many things going on at Virginia Tech that it's hard to really pinpoint what the issues are. I would say the first thing is just ball security, and Justin Fuente's been talking about that. In fact, he benched his quarterback, Ryan Willis, at the end of the ODU game because Willis turned the ball over after having the turnover-laden effort in the loss at Boston College. He brought him back the next week, so it's not like it was more of to send a message, which is even one turnover is not acceptable. But turnovers have been killer for this Virginia Tech team. When you look at the stats, offensively at least, they move the ball well. They're right at 400 yards a game. They're throwing the ball well. They're running the ball better than they have under Fuente. Which is not to say that anything resembling the Frank Beamer years, but they're running the ball better. And then, defensively, everything except for the amount of points they give up, they've actually been improving. 329 yards per game on defense is It's not the best Bud Foster unit that we'll ever see, but it's better than last year. They were giving up 400 plus last year per game. But those turnovers are giving opponents short fields, and short fields translate into points. You look at the average scores; it's 27.7 to 23.0 for Virginia Tech. So, that doesn't reflect how the offense and defense move the ball or prevent movement by the other team. It does reflect field position. It reflects turnovers, etc. So, I think turnovers are a huge thing here for Virginia Tech. Ryan Willis has thrown for 739, 7 touchdowns in 3 games. Those are good numbers. He's thrown for 246 yards a game. The interceptions and fumbles have been issues. For Virginia Tech, it's just emphasize not making the silly mistakes, and especially in plus territory for the opposing offense. That's easier said than done, though. I mean, through 3 games, they continue to have those issues. I think for Virginia Tech tonight, I mean, they got the home crowd. That's a big advantage, obviously. But in Friday night, night games in Blacksburg. Now, I say this, I'm kind of talking traditionally more than I've been talking about recency with this Virginia Tech program. But in the Frank Beamer years, you didn't want to go play in Blacksburg at night. That was the worst thing you could possibly imagine if you were an opposing team, to have to go play in Blacksburg at night on ESPN. Virginia Tech owned night games on ESPN. But, the last couple weeks, there have been a lot of empty seats there in Lane Stadium. Fans are upset with the mediocre play of the last couple of years. They see it continuing this year. It'll be interesting to see how the crowd shows up tonight. If there's empty seats, we'll see it right away. And if that's the case, it won't be quite as intimidating an environment. But still, a night game in Blacksburg still carries some allure to opposing teams, and Duke knows that. Duke's played. And David Cutcliffe and his coaching staff have coached in this environment before. They'll have their team ready for this.
It's going to be interesting. Again, a fun watch, and I truly believe if they can get it done tonight, then it carries over. You've got your home ACC opener next week under the lights with Pitt, and then you have a Georgia Tech game, and then, lo and behold, you're going to have an undefeated Virginia team waiting for him at Scott Stadium. And that's the dream. You got to have an undefeated Virginia team hosting a 1-loss Duke team, and the headline, the banner will say, for the Coastal Division Championship. That's been in my head for, 25 years or so. But maybe not the word coastal, because the Coastal hasn't been around quite that long. But it's living the dream, and both teams have a chance to, I think, really, Virginia has an opportunity to step up on the biggest stage there is, and I think a Duke win tonight gives them an opportunity to guarantee themselves a successful season going forward. We broke down, the upcoming weekend games for the ACC, and I'm noticing a trend that there's a lot of games, and this will sound kind of different, but there's a lot of games that are going to get played this week and next week that on paper right now look like toss-up type of games, and not necessarily toss-up in a good way, but more along the lines of somebody has to win this game. And the one example, there's 2 pretty good examples this week. NC State at Florida State, Wake at Boston College. So in both situations, you're looking at this saying, okay, which team is going to show up and take care of business? Do you have, and we talked about them briefly on Monday, is there anything about either one of those matchups that would make you want to try to watch some of that game?
Let's see. The NC State-Florida State game, it would be the first one I go to. I think I was saying last Friday that, having watched Florida State with my own eyes, when I'm in a stadium and see a team, not watching through the filter of TV cameras, listening to the announcer, just seeing it with myself and seeing it with my own eyes and kind of forming my own impressions, I thought I liked that Florida State team, even though they lost that game in Charlottesville. I like that Florida State team. Their offense moved the ball for the most part consistently in that game. The defense wore down, but and then they struggled last week in their win over Louisville, a game that I don't think they should have struggled quite that much. They won the game, so good for that. But They're the team with a 2-2 record going into a game against a team with a 3-1 record, but I think Florida State's a better team in this one. And so I might be able to peek in at this one, at least in the second half of this one, if my writing is done after the UVA-Notre Dame game. This is a game that's sort of it's NC State's first ACC game, so it's weird to say it's an elimination game already, but I think it feels like if NC State goes to Tallahassee and gets the doors blown off, which I think is a possibility, NC State's probably going to – it's going to be the beginning of what could probably be like a 6-6 type season for them. Wake Forest Boston College, very interesting game. It'll be at 3:30, so I'm sure nobody listening to this podcast will see a second of that game. But I think it's worth if it was a 12 o'clock or a 7:30 game, I think we'd all be watching it. Wake Forest is ranked. But there's a lot of question. They haven't played anybody in the ACC. Boston College is 1-0 in the ACC, beat Virginia Tech, also 3-1 overall, lost to Kansas. So positive, negative. But this feels like this could be just a heck of a ball game, and I give Boston College the advantage because the game's in Chestnut Hill, but. Man, I expect a lot out of this game, and I think you've talked about this, Jerry. If Wake wins this game, they probably start 7-0, which is just amazing to think. I'll put that in the context of I think I wrote about this in a column a couple weeks ago. But, I was kind of gauging interest noting interest, I guess, in talking to the various coaches at the ACC kickoff. When you went to Dabo, of course. Dabo it felt like 200 people standing around him when you were trying to just stick your tape recorder anywhere near to get quotes from him. Mac Brown, same thing. He might have even had more than Dabo just because it was the newness of being back for him. I walked up to Dave Clawson and say, "Hey, Dave, how's it going?" I mean, it was just that easy to talk to Dave Clawson. And he's the coach of a top 25 team right now. Great to see. I mean, I love seeing that. I love seeing that the guys that everybody's overlooking is doing well. And again, I'd love to watch this game if it wasn't for the fact that it's starting at 3:30, the same time as UVA-Notre Dame. Clemson, Carolina has interest. Carolina won 2 games they weren't supposed to. They've probably lost 2 they weren't supposed to. I said early in the season, maybe before the season when we talked, Jerry, I thought that this Carolina team would probably do that. They'd win some, and that they probably had no reason winning, and they might lose a game or 2 they have no reason losing, and they've got no reason to win this game or even be competitive in this game with Clemson. But it's in Kenan Stadium. There will be 57,000 Carolina blue pom-poms waving, at least at the beginning. Everybody's got a chance, and so. Trevor Lawrence has been a little concerning. He leads the ACC in interceptions. He's got 5. Bryce Perkins has 4. The 2 quarterbacks that everybody had as the best 2 quarterbacks in the league are turning the ball over a little bit. So, early Trevor Lawrence interception, pick 6. Carolina gets up early. Could get interesting. I don't know. So I think there's 3 right there that certainly have our attention.
So the Clemson Carolina game, I think will be a fun watch. For those who are watching it, it's going to be interesting because Clemson has. Chris, I guess we're at this time of the season to where we're going to start getting to connect dots going forward because we're gauging teams based on this game versus that game, and we're still looking for Virginia Tech will have a better example after this week. I think Boston College will have a better idea of what's going on this week, and I think the same thing is true with Florida State. They did lose some games, but they lost to a ranked Boise State team and a ranked UVA team, and one of those was on the road. So I'm not sure if Florida State can't turn the ship around a little bit this week with a convincing win. On the college football side of things, I had 3 other notes I wanted to get your opinion on before we switched over. One of them was incredibly disturbing to me, the story coming from the University of Houston, where their quarterback, who actually was getting, Mr. King was getting some small versions of Heisman hype going into the season. The season has started out. Houston is now 1-3. And we see that the quarterback has decided, hey, I'm going to redshirt, take the rest of the season off, and come back and play next year, and we'll do this again. And then Dana, the new coach there, has actually came out and said, hey, that's a good idea. That's a smart thing to do. Chris, this one bothers me in so many different directions, but you can talk me down from it. Explain why this isn't a horrible sign of things to come.
I read a piece, and it probably was in The Athletic again, so I'm like doing free advertising for The Athletic. Good website, good journalism on that website. And it did give a different perspective, so I'll kind of make the argument there. I'm still kind of on the fence. But D'Eriq King, deciding to sit out the rest of the season, and how this isn't bad for Dana Holgorsen, the first-year coach at Houston, had a nice run, I thought, at West Virginia before the welcome mat got worn out there. So if you're Dana Holgorsen and you're trying to build your program back up, D'Eriq King is a senior this year, so if he would have played the rest of the season, then you're starting over with a new quarterback next year. If you're Holgorsen and you go, at this stage, Houston's 1-3. That's a little surprising. They knew they'd lose to Oklahoma, or they thought they would. They thought it was likely they could lose to Oklahoma, but then they've blown a couple games they probably shouldn't have lost, including the Tulane game that a lot of folks saw, the trick play at the end, the touchdown with 3 seconds to go. That was definitely a surprise. So here's how this could spin well for Holgorsen and the Houston program going forward. In the conference they play in the AAC, they still likely are going to go. They're 1-3 now. They're still likely going to be assuming that they can develop their backup well enough. There's still a possibility of 6-6, 7-5 type season. There wasn't much of a likelihood that D'Eriq King was going to lead them to much better. In a sense. Houston's a program that, as of a couple of years ago, looked to win double digits. They were when the previous coaching regime, Herman and his coaching regime was there. They were thinking about being a BC or a playoff buster from the group of 5. And so to go 7-5 or 8-4, if you keep D'Eriq King all season, that's 8-4. If and that's a best case scenario. That's not anything to get excited about. And then you start over next year with a new quarterback. Develop your backup this year, because your backup is going to be your starter for the rest of this year. And then next year you start with whoever that is, who ends up being your guy who starts the rest of this season, and D'Eriq King. There's a talk about D'Eriq King. He's actually said this himself, that he kind of realizes at his size. Now, Kyler Murray's 5'10". He was the first pick in the draft. He seems to be playing well so far for the Arizona Cardinals. But D'Eriq King has acknowledged that at his size, 5'9", the NFL probably isn't a likelihood for him at quarterback. But at receiver, very likely. A guy with his athleticism is not going to be kept off the field if he changes positions. And so it's a possibility. I'm not saying it's a likelihood, but it's a possibility that he comes back next year if Houston develops a quarterback this year who takes the job over, and that D'Eriq King spends his last season as a wide receiver showcasing his talents for the NFL from that position. And so if this isn't what a lot of people assumed it was at first, after Houston lost to Oklahoma in the opener, Lincoln Riley praised D'Eriq King up and down about how great a player he was. And, of course, Lincoln Riley has a great track record with transfer quarterbacks, winning Heisman trophies and all this kind of stuff. That what we're seeing here from D'Eriq King is, I'm going to sit out the rest of this year and transfer up the road a little bit to Norman and play for Lincoln Riley and win a Heisman trophy and be a first-round draft pick. If it's not that, and it is what D'Eriq King says it is, and it's what Dana Holgorsen says it is, and they're just kind of they're patching in this season. They're going to look for a good second season. If it's anything other than that, then it could be a problem. But I'm going to buy into what they're saying it is right now, and say that this is a positive for Houston.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see, because the position change would have it make sense. It's just like the same thing for me, going back to the ODU game just for a second, the Wilder call on 4th and 1, I'm just in my mind, he was selling short his defense and their ability to hold UVA. I'm not sure of the message it sends the rest of the team, the way that this has played out. I understand why Dana would like it to play out the way that he has. It does work for his benefit. My concern is, it's something that hasn't been done in this obvious of a manner before. I just would hate to see it become a trend going forward, if you will. And a couple other ones I wanted to sneak in here. We talked about Fuentes. His team last night, I got a chance to watch some of the Navy game. Chris, Memphis is his former team. Memphis is 4-0. They're 4-0 with an outside shot of actually running the table now. And it's interesting to see, do we think that that's in part tied to their success? Is it still tied to the groundwork that Fuentes laid there? Or does the credit now just go to the current coaching staff for taking the handoff and actually upping Memphis' game?
Fuente was only there for 4 years. I'm pretty sure that's the case, and he's been gone now. This is the 4th year that he's been gone, so I would not necessarily credit him. In his first 2 years, yeah, he rebuilt the program to a degree from there. I'm kind of pulling up his record here as I look. They were 4-8, 3-9, 10-3, 9-3. But again, that was 2015 was the last season he was there. So I don't know if I'd say that's groundwork he laid. They had 2, rebuilding seasons, and they had 2 pretty good seasons. So I don't know. I don't know if I'd jump out there and say it's him. I want to look real quick at their season records previous to him. They've had some runs before him. He took over for a guy. So Tommy West was there ahead of him. And what was Tommy West? Because West, the program had some heights there, but then struggled down the stretch of the West era. They were 8-4 in 2004, 9-4 in 2003. So I mean, they've had success. They've also not had success. When you play in a conference like the AAC, think about Central Florida. Central Florida's hot right now. They lost to Pitt last week, but they're hot right now, and they have been the last couple of seasons. But they're only 3 or 4 seasons removed from a winless record. When you play in the group of 5, it's very much feast or famine as to what you get. You're playing with the slim pickings left over by the Power 5 guys, and so you can sometimes accumulate talent and do something with it, but the coaches largely are guys who are on their way up the ladder or hoping they're on their way up the ladder. And so success can be very fleeting. I would say 4 years in the AAC, 4 years being away from an AAC program like Fuente's been, that's an eternity to be away from a program there. There's faint memories, I would suggest, of Justin Fuente at Memphis at this stage.
Last one on the college football side I want to run by you here. I read a stat this week that you made the reference a couple weeks ago. The Texas A&M program has more money than God. They officially were named the number 1 most valuable college football team, and where they had actually made $94 million out of $147 million collected. Now, with that said, they're currently 2-2, and they have a game left, Chris, with number 2, number 3, and number 4. I have to believe in my mind this season has 7-5 written all over it, and that's if you don't slip up and let somebody upset you.
Yeah. Hey, even if you go and win one of those games against 2, 3, and 5, or even win 2 of them, you're still going to be 9-3. I mean, that's the reality of playing in the SEC West and then having Georgia as your crossover game this year. That's reality, but that's why you pay Jimbo Fisher $7.5 million a year guaranteed. They don't. I was getting ready to say they don't expect him to turn it around right away. They also do expect him to turn it around right away, but they're committed for 10 years, $75 million. So They're paying him that money whether he flames out or not. So, it's year 2. I'm trying to be fair when I say it's year 2 for him. Uh, I'm thinking back to year 2 of Bronco. I'm thinking back to year 2 of some other coaches in years past. It takes a bit. I mean, that Texas A&M program was down when he took over, when Jimbo took over. You've got to have a few recruiting classes that play football the way you do. We talk about the recruiting class rankings, how many 5 and 4 stars you have, everything else. It's more important. I mean, yeah, it's great if you can get 4 and 5 stars who fit your system. That's great, but it's more important to have guys who fit your system, and then they get trained to play the way you do. That you develop the talent that you get. If a 4-star who's 17 years old still has to get stronger, still has to get faster. I mean, all that shows is the potential at that age. They still have to get better when they get there. They have to get better every year, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. And so it takes time. There's 85 scholarships in Division 1A football. Your 2 deep is 44 plus your specialists, so maybe 48. That takes some time to get 48 guys who play the game the way you do. Just for comparison, I talked about the article in The Athletic I read about UVA football and its rise, its ascendancy. Last year, Bronco got in trouble. I was one of those giving him trouble for saying publicly that he only had 27 ACC caliber players of the 81 guys at that time on his roster. He says now he's got 37 ACC caliber players. And what he measures that on is he's developed a system of metrics based on your performance in running drills, strength and conditioning, et cetera, and he has it's basically kind of built on sort of like a black belt system. There's 5 colors in this system. You wear the color that you're associated with based on your achievement on this scale when you're doing conditioning, when you're in practice. So like a white shirt is first level, the black shirt is the 5th level, and the 5th level is ACC caliber, and he's got 37 of those guys. I don't know how extensive other coaches are in terms of that, but I'd be surprised to learn that other coaches don't have their own system of metrics, how they judge their players' development, et cetera, et cetera. And so it takes time. I mean, Bronco here is in year 4, and he feels like he's got 37 ACC caliber players based on his system of metrics. Jimbo's only in year 2, so I'm giving him some time. Texas A&M has to because they're paying him all that money anyway. So I expect he'll get that turned around. But, this year, when you play in the SEC West, you're guaranteed to play a tough schedule. Then you play Clemson non-conference, and it just makes it even tougher.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be fun to look forward to going up, seeing what they finish with, and whether right now I have them trying to come in at 7-5, but they're going to have to be patient. And a lot of times when you have that kind of money and that kind of stout, patience doesn't come easy. Chris, I've got a quick fun one here, for me anyway. It's Tony Romo. I don't know if you saw the news, or the sports, if you will. So Tony Romo got a sponsor's exemption to play in the Safeway tournament this week in Northern California. Lo and behold, he goes out and he shoots a 2-under yesterday. And he carded a 70, and he's actually, I believe it's in 20th place. So there's a little bit of a potential conflict coming here if he were to earn his first cut, making the cut. He's not going to be in the booth for his football game. Yeah. And I'm pulling for him. I'm pulling for him to make the cut. But how do you think the folks at the network are handling this? You've done some games. You know what goes into doing a game. What are the folks at the network doing right now?
Well, I understand Boomer Esiason is in the bullpen warming up right now. Boomer's a good guy to have as sort of your spot starter in this kind of situation. But they're rooting for Tony to do well. You think back when Tony Romo was the backup in Dallas, coming out of Eastern Illinois. What we first heard about this backup from Eastern Illinois was he might be better at golf than he is at football. And I remember that from roughly 20 years ago, probably not quite 20 years ago, but around that amount of years ago. And to see him now, I mean, good for him. I mean, Steph Curry has been playing some of minor tour events. I don't know what those minor tours are called anymore, like golf.com maybe tour or whatever. Steph's played well on some of those. I'm not sure if he's ever made a cut on any of those, but uh, to play at this level, it's one thing to be a guy who can go out to the golf course on a Tuesday afternoon and shoot a 65 when there's no pressure, there's no cameras, there's no galleries and everything else. But to be able to do that on a Tuesday afternoon and then go out on a Thursday afternoon when there is pressure and do this, that's awesome for Tony Romo that he's being able to sort of live that dream. I'll kind of equate it on my own level to running the New York City Marathon. I've talked about that twice now on the podcast, but to be able to do something at a high level just one time. I mean, it's not like Tony's going to go out next year and win the Masters or anything, but for a guy like that who had the skill set, maybe if he had coming out of college decided to go pro in golf or try to go pro in golf, maybe he could have become a consistent winner. I mean, he was talked about in that respect when he came out of college. But just to be able to go do it and then make a cut, oh gosh, that's awesome. And yeah, now from the perspective of the broadcaster, I had to do some arranging last year to get to the Final Four. My broadcast schedule for ESPN3 had me doing. I had to miss the Sweet 16 round to be able to do some games that I had committed to. But then when the Who's made the Final Four, I was able to finagle my way out of town and on a plane to Minneapolis. Now I still had to do the Friday night game of a 3-game set, but then I was able to get on a plane early Saturday morning, get to Minneapolis, sit in my seat 5 minutes before the game started. After a long day of travel, connecting flight, everything else. But thanks to the folks at VMI at ESPN for giving me that opportunity, because, my God, if I'd have missed that, my life would be different. And I'm sure for Tony Romo, same thing. If he'd have to give up a chance at making a PGA Tour cut for 1 weekend of football, that's all he's talking about, 1 weekend of football, one game on a Sunday. He'd regret that. So I'm glad for him, and I'm glad to see CBS making the arrangements for him.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that CBS is not only pulling for him because it's the right thing to do, but I think it becomes a huge feel-good story for them.
Yeah.
I feel like that they were going to. Anybody worth their salt said we have to make this happen. We have to be prepared for this to happen, because it could happen, and we can't be the ones to say no. But I want to go with the idea that they knew it was the right thing to do anyway, and I'll be anxious to see how the round today goes. Next one I got for you here, and this is, we've talked off and on about Colangelo and the USA team, and I thought the story was kind of in the past until what happens next. And the same way that Richard Jefferson came out with a list, we had a different case this week, somebody coming out with a list of who the message was directed at. And the 3 names, and these people were all players that supposedly said yeah, then no, and they were James Harden, Anthony Davis, and Damian Lillard. So now it's a situation, I still don't know why it was said out loud. I still haven't felt the feedback that I wanted to feel, to where that somebody could have stepped in and corrected it, if you will. And is there anything left to this story, or is this something that's just going to eventually fade to black?
I think it'll fade to black because training camps are starting very soon. Maybe some have already started. I haven't paid attention, but I'm looking at the calendar and realizing that we are at that stage where training camps probably should be starting now, because the season's only about a month away. I think it'll fade. I mean, I can see in each of those 3 cases why I would have sat out this. I mean, again, I've said this a lot this summer as we talked about this team and the roster. It's the weird part of this is FIBA, the International Basketball Authority, moving this particular tournament from what was an off-year tournament, basically in the middle of the Olympic cycle, 2 years between Olympics on each side, to the year before the Olympics. What that does for everyone, not just U.S. NBA players, but everybody, both foreign NBA players, but also players who play in foreign countries. For us, foreign countries, Europe and Asia. it means that everybody would be committing to this summer their season with their professional teams who pay them a livelihood, and then having another summer next year, and then having after that, your next season to play before you get time off. Basically, you commit yourself to 2 full years of basketball with no time off if you played this year and then next year. So FIBA, I think that was just a disastrous move for FIBA to do. Other countries were able to retain more of their top talent, and we saw that in the results. Americans finished 7th, in the tournament. But I don't blame Harden. Harden is a player on a team, the Houston Rockets, that thinks it's a finals contender. Lillard is a player on a team, the Portland Trail Blazers, thinks he's a finals contender. Anthony Davis, now with the Lakers, they could be a playoff contender at least with the accumulation of talent of him and LeBron James. They could be a finals contender in the West. So if you're a finals contender, you're playing through the late part of June, and then you got a couple weeks off. Then you're in training camp for the Olympics. That's tough. If you do that this year and you do a whole season and you play all the way through June and then you're a couple weeks off, I mean, not only is it tiresome, you don't get to see your family very much, but also when you play tired, you could get injured. You're more likely to get injured when you're stressed. So no, I don't blame them. And that all said, season's getting ready to start. We'll have NBA wall to wall just a few weeks from now. I'm a huge NBA fan. I'm a huge basketball fan in general. So it'll be talked about on some of those national broadcasts, but it'll be immaterial. We won't talk about it much because we'll get excited about this coming season.
Agreed there again. I got 3 quick. That's it. I think you know a little bit about baseball, so I've got a couple quick ones here, and then a story for you. We talked about it briefly, or I brought it up a couple weeks ago. I couldn't remember, and I'm counting on the people that looked it up for this to be true. We talked about the number of 100-win teams in a season, and I'm being told, Chris, that we've never had 4. We've never had 4 in the same season, and we have 3 in the books. And going into the final 3 days of the season, Minnesota just needs to win 1 game. Atlanta would have to sweep the Mets. So there's a shot at a 4th, even remotely, there's a shot at a 5th. And you're sitting here, and on the flip side of that, you have 4 teams that have lost 100. So you're in a situation, I like the history gets created. We've been playing baseball a long time. Again, good for the game, bad for the game.
I mean, it is the game. I don't know if it's good or bad. I mean, what I don't understand is teams tanking in either baseball or football. We're seeing that the Dolphins aren't playing very hard right now. They gutted their roster, and I can't imagine playing on that team and thinking that the front office wants us to go out there and get blocked and tackled every week. Every play could be our last, and they don't even care about this season for one guy in a sport where there's 53 guys on the roster, and one guy can't make that much of a difference. In baseball, same thing, and even worse. At least the NFL is like number 1 pick. If you're tanking and trying to get the number 1 pick, you theoretically are getting a very talented player who will be on your roster and probably playing next year. In baseball, if you're tanking for draft picks who even if you take a college guy who is somewhat ready, that college guy is still going to probably start at Double-A, and he might be on your roster, your major league roster next year. It might be 2 years, might be 3 years. You need an accumulation of players. And it takes time to develop them. It's not like in basketball or football. When they're drafted, they're expected to be on the pro roster, the major league roster right away. It's not the same in baseball. So I don't get tanking in baseball. I understand like the Houston Astros kind of set this trend, and they did a great job on the back end of it. In 2013, 2014, they lost 100 games each year. They've been a playoff team the last, this be like the 4th or 5th year. They have a World Series, so good for the Astros. They turn things around, and I can understand to some degree there, but you're asking your paying customers to watch bad baseball. It can be tough, and I think what MLB is trying to say is, hey, of the teams that are the teams that are already qualified for the playoffs or the teams in the mix, there's 3 still in the American League for 2 spots. So there's a total of 11 teams right now. I guess it would be 11. 11 teams that would make the playoffs. Is that right? There's 4 wild cards. There's 3 division champions. There's 10 teams overall make the playoffs. There's 11 teams right now in the mix. Of those 11, 5 of them are quote-unquote small market teams, teams that are in the bottom half of revenues from the baseball perspective. So it's not like when we talk about all these 100-win teams and all these great teams this year that we're talking about just the rich being the richest. Yes, we're talking about the Yankees and Dodgers, but we're also talking about the Oakland A's, the Tampa Bay Rays, to a degree, the Washington Nationals. They don't get TV money because of the Masson screw up. So yeah, it's not quite the sake where the people who are buying the great teams, like in Premier League soccer, literally those are the teams that oligarchs and billionaires from Europe buy the best teams there. We're not having that here, but there's there's some teams who are trying really hard. There's some teams who aren't, and that itself's not good for baseball. But at least it's not like it was, say, 25 years ago when it just felt like that there were a couple teams buying pennants. I don't think that's the case anymore. You should be rewarded for trying, and those teams that are trying are succeeding, and those that aren't, the Philadelphia Phillies did not succeed. They're a rare example of that. But no, I'd like to see the teams that aren't competitive try harder, but it's hard to argue if what you're trying to do is replenish your minor leagues and work towards the future. The Baltimore Orioles are a great example of that. At the end of their run in 2018, which didn't work out, but they kept their veteran guys from a pretty solid core from about 2012 to 2017 that had won a couple of divisions, had played in a couple of wild card games. They kept that core together for one more year. Didn't work out. They tried. Now they're rebuilding, and rebuilding means they got rid of all those guys. They're starting from absolute scratch. They started with nothing. Minor leagues were completely depleted because they had traded off a lot of their minor league pieces to acquire pieces that could complement their division and wild card teams. So yeah, it takes a couple years to build back up, but as long as they're trying in those ways, I don't mind what you see at the major league level. Fans have to remember that baseball teams, the major league team, there are 7 or 8 or 9 in some cases minor league teams under that major league team, kind of propping that up. And the success you have at the minor league level eventually translates. As long as they're trying at those levels, I don't mind a year or two of the losing at the big league level.
Well, it's kind of interesting because both Houston and the Yankees had a series, Chris, this year. Houston took 18 out of 19 from the Mariners. And if I'm not mistaken, that was the same number for the Yankees and the Orioles. You're in a situation to where if you – obviously, both those teams are pretty talented. Now, Baltimore went on to become one of the 100-loss teams. The Mariners avoided that. But it's tough for me to understand in baseball, unlike football, where the sheer volume of your stars is so much greater and they can impact a game so much differently. It's tough for me to fathom how somebody could play 19 times and one team could win 18 of them. Now, again, Houston would still have a nice record without it, and so would the Yankees. But it's going to be interesting, and you made a great example. The Phillies spent an awful lot of money, and they've got to win 2 out of 3 this weekend to be a 500 baseball team. Yeah. So it'll be interesting from that standpoint. A quick note out here, emotional game last night for the Mariners. King Felix actually took the mound for what most people are considering to be his last start as a Mariner. He's had a phenomenal career out here, and he made a point of saying that he's not retiring. He's going to be looking to pitch someplace next year. It was a terrible year for him this year with injuries and loss of velocity, but he had a nice night. Ichiro was out there with him for the process, and he went 5 1/3 in the game last night. Again, came up on the short end of it, but he has stated that him and his he's had a wonderful career out here. It's all been with the Mariners. He signed as a 19-year-old. He won a Cy Young, in a season that was not his best statistical win-loss season by any means, but people have always appreciated how hard he's worked, and it was nice to see him get the farewell he deserved. But Chris, that leads to my next question. I'm sure you've seen the highlight where the Texas Rangers let a foul ball drop amongst four players, admitted to doing it so that the young man on the mound could have one more shot at a strikeout. If you saw the highlight, what was your take on the process?
I'm someone who looks up stats all the time. When I'm reading an article, I'll look up stats of a player from 20, 30, 50, 80 years ago. And I think about it in that context. The young Chris or the middle-aged Chris in, say, 40 or 50 years, he's looking up stats of this pitcher and sees that he had 200 one year. He's not going to know about the drop foul pop. He's just going to say, wow, 200 strikeouts. He only had this many innings. Wow, 200. That stands out. It's a game that neither team is a playoff team. His manager already let the pitcher in the game a little late. He'd given up 5 runs. He's still pitching in the 9th inning. So that tells you that there was a plan going in. It's your last game of the season. He'd thrown 127, or left the game with 127 pitches. You wouldn't do that in August. You wouldn't do that in May. Either case, you wouldn't leave a guy in who's given up 5 runs into the 9th with that many pitches. They were leaving him in the game to get to 200 strikeouts. And, it's a stat. It's a number. It's a round number. 200 is better than 199. I'm actually fine with it because, it's not like – now, I wouldn't have been fine with it if, say, the Rangers were playing – there are 3 teams competing for the 2 wild card spots in the American League, Cleveland, Tampa, and Oakland. If one of those 3 teams was involved, I wouldn't have been fine with it. But I don't think if one of those teams was involved, one, that the pitcher would have even been in the game in the 9th inning. Probably wouldn't have pitched the 8th inning in that game. They certainly wouldn't have let a foul pop drop in a game that had something to do with the playoff race. But this game had nothing to do with the playoff race. And still they had to get the guy out. I mean, if the guy hits a 2-run homer, ties a game, then they really look stupid. I actually didn't have a problem with that last night.
Well, it was kind of fun for me to see the exchange between the managers, and they were talking about that the Red Sox, once they realized earlier in the game what was happening, that all of a sudden they started aggressively swinging at all the first pitches.
Yeah.
To where, I felt it gave a game that had no meaning kind of some meaning. It gave people something to talk about. And I agree with you. No harm, no foul, because the game, at the end of the day, was kind of irrelevant in the equation. I'm going to switch briefly to the NFL just for a minute, Chris. Kudos to Daniel Jones for being named the NFC Offensive Player of the Week in his first start. Was excited about that. The second thing that happened was last night. I didn't see any of the game, but Aaron Rodgers actually passed Fran Tarkenton on the all-time touchdown pass list. He moved into the number 9 spot. And congratulations to Aaron. I thought it was kind of cool because the next person in his sights is Eli Manning. Eli Manning's in the 8th spot overall. That's just for everybody who says that Eli didn't have a real good career out there when I mentioned that. But the question I have for you, Chris, and I know that we don't have a lot of focus on the NFL right now, but with the Green Bay loss, it leaves 7 teams without a loss. And I want you to answer me this. Which is a bigger surprise to you, the Buffalo Bills at 3-0-0 or the Detroit Lions at 2-0-1?
Oh, definitely the Bills. The Bills have just struggled so much since the Jim Kelly era, which is so long ago now. When you see the highlights, like you see this being the 100th year of the NFL, you see a lot of Scott Norwood. Unfortunately for poor Scott Norwood, you see a lot of Scott Norwood. And, this Bills team didn't come into the season with any expectations. Now, they got to play the Patriots on Sunday. They've not had success, to say the least, against the Patriots for a long time. But, you beat the Jets 17-16. You beat the Giants, a Giants team at the end of the Eli Manning era, at least at that stage, and you squeak one out of the Bengals. I mean, they're 3-0 on paper, and we'll see. It's kind of a test game for them, kind of like the UVA-Notre Dame game this weekend for the Bills with the Patriots. This is a game that they've played a lot. They play them twice a year, and they don't play them well. And so, but I'm surprised just because, again, this team is that nobody expected this. Josh Allen, the quarterback, was maligned when he first took over last year. Poor kid can't throw the ball straight. He's completing 64% of his passes, 285 yards a game. Before the season they cut LaShawn McCoy, who's picked back up somewhere else. I can't think where he got picked up, but he's playing somewhere else. But Frank Gore, who has been playing since I think the 1920s, he's doing well for them though, averaging 54 yards a game, and they're doing it. They're getting it done with guys that Allen's growing into his role. Frank Gore, I said the 1920s. I think I'm a little off there, but Frank Gore's been playing forever. He was a third round draft pick in 2005 as a running back. That's amazing. Most running backs are a 3 or 4 year job, and you can barely walk afterwards. He's been playing for 15 years. This Frank Gore, who's still cranking out the yards for this team. He ran for 1,695 yards in 2006. I mean, so good for Frank Gore. 14. I didn't realize all this about Frank Gore. I didn't know he was still playing until I looked this up. 14,900 yards for Frank Gore. No, I didn't expect Frank Gore to be leading the Bills in rushing, and didn't expect the Bills to be 3-0. So we'll have to see what they do with the Patriots this weekend. Maybe the turmoil in Patriots land with the word that Brady and Belichick were not on board with cutting Antonio Brown. Maybe there's some discord in the clubhouse there, the locker room, and maybe the Bills could sneak an upset here. That's the rest of the world who doesn't like the Patriots certainly hope so.
It's kind of interesting. My ties to watching the Buffalo Bills play go back to Thad Lewis, and the Bills fans. Chris, I got to go to 3 different games at the stadium there. The stadium is an old, worn-down stadium in an old, worn-down part of town. But I've never seen a group of fans that just want to win any more than this group. And they have fun. They have fun trying. They add a whole other group or a whole other title to tailgating up there. But it's been a long time. It's been a long time for them. And whether they win this week or not, it's a good story. And all 3 of the wins, they kind of eked them out, but wins they are. Real quick, the WNBA notes, the Mystics and the Aces just completed their semifinal set. So what you have now is the Mystics are heading home. They won the best of 5, 3-1. 2 games came down to the final possession. The Mystics are hosting on Sunday as the number 1 seed, the Connecticut Sun. The number 2 seed, they'll start their best 3 out of 5. And all of the semifinal games were available at ESPN2. I don't know how hard it would be to find a ticket there in Northern Virginia, but if this ought to be a fun watch. It's the 2 best teams in the WNBA all season long playing the best of 5. Chelsea Plum actually finished the 5 games, her 5 playoff games, averaging 15.2. 7.6 assists and 4.8 rebounds for somebody standing 5'8". Christian, amazingly, again, if this was an NBA player, it would have been more noted. But Chelsea Plum, the deciding game against the Mystics, never came off the court. She actually played the entire 40 minutes. I went back looking through all of the post-game notes and all the talk afterwards. That was never brought up. That just happens so seldomly that it was a surprise to me that didn't end up at least getting mentioned in it. But the Mystics are on their way now. They're playing the second best team, and that should be a fun matchup to watch. Real quick, my final thought: Marty Brennaman. For those of you that are baseball fans, you probably know Marty Brenneman as the longtime voice of the Cincinnati Reds. And yesterday he called his final game after 46 seasons with the Reds. My history with Marty Brenneman goes back even further in the fact that Marty is actually from Portsmouth, Virginia, and is in a situation to where, Chris, he was the Virginia Squires radio guy when the ABA team was still in existence. And he was my first exposure to a sportscaster. And Marty Brenneman, when the Squires had at the end, once Irving was a part of the team, they were a bad basketball team. But they were my basketball team, and I'd listen to them every night on the radio. And Marty Brenneman had the ability to keep you on the edge of your seat with the excitement that he had, the style that he had, and it didn't matter if your team was down 28 points. Marty Brenneman had an ability to make you feel like what you were listening to mattered in a manner that I've never seen or heard from anybody else. I'm going to miss him. But my question to you is, I feel like I've even took my writing style over the years based off of Marty's enthusiasm. Chris, who did you grow up listening to or watching and listening to that might have had a lasting effect on you and your career?
Definitely Don Sutton, the Hall of Fame pitcher, Los Angeles Dodgers, but he was, and it still is, as far as I know, affiliated with the Atlanta Braves. He did the TV games on TBS. I watched the Braves every night for many years, and what I liked about him was, so many guys. He did play-by-play because the way the Braves announcers did things, they interspersed their radio crew and their TV crew. So at least for a long time. So in the middle of the fifth inning, they would switch the radio crew and TV crew, and so each side did half the game on TV, half the game on radio. So they had two teams. And in those teams, even though, like say, Don Sutton will be paired with Skip Carey, Don would do innings of play-by-play. And so, despite he was a player, but he would do some play-by-play as well. But so many guys who are announcers, you know them for their shtick, whatever that might be. Don didn't really have a shtick. I mean, he was just a guy who explained the game. And he brought the radio. I thought he did a great job bringing the radio baseball guy to TV in a way that, if it was anybody but Don Sutton, he'd have a producer saying, "You're talking too much. Don't talk so much about the game because they can see the pictures." That's what they tell me, on the broadcast. Because I'll do today I'm doing TV for soccer. Now I'm doing play-by-play, and I have no color guy, so I'll be talking to myself for 2 hours. But when I do baseball with Wade on TV, I've done radio baseball for years. With TV, you don't talk as much because they can see the picture, they can see the score, they can see a lot of things. But tomorrow I'll do VMI football, and I do things like remind you the score every so often, et cetera, et cetera. But from Don, what I picked up was explain the game, and he played the game. I didn't play the game at a high level. But I would like to think I know the game pretty well. The game, and I know football, and I know baseball, and I know basketball pretty well. To be able to explain to you how it's played, how the strategies are implemented, what the players are thinking when they're out there, and he was so good at educating the listener, the viewer, on the inside part of baseball that. I tried, I actually think about this an awful lot when I'm doing a baseball game especially, but even when I do other sports. I'm trying to educate the person watching or listening, not just tell them what's going on, but educate them as to why, what the players might be thinking, what the coaches are strategizing, et cetera. And so Don, man, I tell you what, I channel him every single game that I broadcast. And from a writing perspective, probably John Feinstein is my idol as far as that goes. I've never had a chance to meet Don Sutton. I've had a chance to meet John Feinstein a couple times. You've been at ACC tournaments with me where John Feinstein was sitting right in front of us. Those were great thrills. But I think Don Sutton even more so though, just because I get to do 45 to 50 broadcasts a year, and no matter what sport it is, I'm thinking of Don Sutton.
And Sutton talked the same way that he pitched, just professionally with a lot of class. And it's kind of funny that you mentioned that, because this week I can't say broke out the ink pen, but I broke out the keyboard and I wrote a story for the local paper, and it got me thinking, and this goes back again to Marty Brenneman for me. I used to, when I was in Virginia and I'd be covering something, I would always, if there was multiple papers covering it, Chris, I would always step aside, let everybody ask their questions, and then I wanted to ask questions because mine were going to be different. One of the other writers from one of the other papers came up to me and says, "What is it with you? Why do you try to cover everything like it's the seventh game of the World Series?" And I looked him square in the eye and said, "Because it is to somebody. Every time an athlete laces up their shoes, their cleats, their spikes, male, female, whatever level, they're out there giving it their absolute best." And that's what I'll remember the most about Marty and the bad Squire team. So, hey, Chris, it's been a blast. We're going to get together on Monday, and I hope that we're both in a celebratory mood.
That's right. Well, tonight, Virginia Tech and Duke, 7 o'clock kickoff from Blacksburg. You can watch on ESPN. 4 o'clock for those out there in Jerry's part of the world, right? So early afternoon or mid-afternoon game for folks on the West Coast, but should be exciting for our ACC fans as well. And tomorrow, 3:30 Eastern, Virginia and Notre Dame. I will be sweating it out a little bit as I'm also calling VMI Wofford at 1:30 on the VMI Sports Radio Network. Listen to me for a quarter or two. Turn the Virginia game on. I'll tell you how it all turns out later. But big weekend. So thanks to Jerry. Thanks to you for listening. And everybody have a great sports weekend.